For almost all of human history, Mars was a distant place that we could only catch glimpses of. And then, in 1965, that changed forever. Mariner 4, a tiny interplanetary NASA probe, sent back the first grainy pictures of that Martian landscape. Suddenly a place where sci-fi authors' imaginations had been running wild for generations, imagining lush valleys or watery canals or alien ruins, was visible. We could see the truth with our own eyes. And at the same time, one of those struggling sci-fi authors was going through a nervous breakdown. Broke, marriage disintegrating, grip on reality loosening, desperately trying to shake the paranoid feeling that the world was closing in on him. And in the midst of this interstellar revelation and personal crisis, he began a story with the lines, "He awoke and wanted Mars." The tale that follows is classic Philip K. Dick, full of cops, conspiracies, false realities, and a constant question of what makes us human. Just like his protagonist in We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, Douglas Quayle, Dick was obsessed with Mars, and he'd imagined his own future world there, set many of his tales there amidst bureaucracy and ruin. But what makes this strange false memories competing realities short story fascinating is that Hollywood was obsessed with it too, and with the glimpses of Mars that it showed us. Creative after creative argued over its meaning and direction. David Cronenberg had a shot at it until eventually it became Total Recall and the 1990 Paul Verhoeven classic we know and love today. It seems that, just like Philip K. Dick, Hollywood just keeps coming back to its obsession with Mars. And so do we, yearning for those pictures from another world, sending probes and rovers, maybe hoping for life, maybe for a revelation, imagining, just like Philip K. Dick when he wrote this slight story, that the future could hold something amazing, something terrifying, something different. In a letter, Dick wrote that the saving grace of sci-fi is the shock of disrecognition, which he believed is a convulsive shock that must invade the reader's mind and wake it up to the possibility of something unthought of, something setting off a chain reaction of wild ideas. That at its core, reading sci-fi is the joy of the discovery of newness. So let's look into Philip K. Dick's thinking on sci-fi and this wonderful story. Forget the movie, forget everything you know about Mars, and embrace the possibility of, well, maybe you've been there before. Yes, today we're looking at Philip K. Dick's seminal short story, We Can Remember It For You Wholesale. There's a reason that it's included in almost all of the selections and anthologies of Dick's classic tales, because it's strange and it's funny and it goes in utterly unexpected directions to unexpected places. Now, I'm a Folio fanboy, and this video was an excuse for me to finally buy this beautiful edition of Philip K. Dick's selected short stories from the Folio Society, and it is absolutely beautiful, and it's got a great selection of stories. Even the slipcase is gorgeous and has like a little illustration in the middle of it as well too, so that's wonderful. It's fantastic, and this is absolutely not sponsored, so sadly any money the channel makes is still going towards feeding my raging folio addiction, but really any edition would suffice. And there are even a few PDFs floating around on the interwebs as well, so do yourself a favour and give We Can Remember It For You Wholesale a read. But if that hasn't persuaded you, or it's been a while, here's the shape of the story. Our protagonist is Douglas Quayle, not Quaid this time, Quayle, a low-level bureaucrat who wakes up to drudgery every morning and a wife who barely tolerates him. He's always wanted to go to Mars, a deeply rooted desire he can't quite explain, but he could never afford to. So he books an appointment with Recall Incorporated instead, which will, as the salesman McLean tells him, not only implant a crystal clear memory that is better than the real thing in his head, but also scatter some kipple around his apartment to even convince him that he's been there in the first place. Quayle reluctantly agrees, and that's when the bottom of everything falls out, because under sedation, it turns out that Quayle actually has gone to Mars. In fact, he killed a political leader there, and now Recall Incorporated is in deep doo-doo. So they do what any respectable corporation does and violates their patient's trust, wipe his memory of ever having been to the company, and then shove him in a cab pointed home. But now there's no stopping Douglas's memory. Things start resurfacing. He remembers bits of Recall. He remembers bits of Mars. He keeps finding inconsistent clues. And eventually his shadowy employers come knocking not keen on someone knowing that the Earth's governments hire assassins to remove problems. A struggle ensues, a mind-reading implant is revealed and involved, and Douglas is on the run, only agreeing to hand himself in when the voice in his head, courtesy of the implant, agrees to try a new memory. And everyone involved, both metaphorically and literally, can forget the whole thing. To make it really stick this time, recall, once again pressed into service, takes Douglas's most deeply held wish and attempts to implant that. This is a fantasy that he saved the Earth as a child by kind of nursing tiny alien invaders back to health, or at least helping them, and securing their good favour. The only problem, as another buzz from McLean's intercom sadly tells him, this fantasy is true as well. The story ends on a reality-level joke that the mild-mannered, downtrodden, and hard-done by Douglas Quayle is not just an interplanetary assassin, but the saviour of Earth to boot. It's a great story, and as the ending shows, it doesn't take itself too seriously, but it does raise some very serious philosophical questions, and I want to treat them the way Philip K. Dick himself suggested that his work should be understood. So first, we'll ask Dick's core question for any sci-fi story. What's the new idea here? And in the process, we'll look a bit at where Dick was in his life and the context in which he was writing too. Then we'll ask the next essential Dickian question. What is reality? Because this is the Martian spiral that our main character falls down, and the one that Hollywood couldn't quite quit. And finally, we'll look at the other essential question that Philip K. Dick asks of the entirety of his work, and the one that sometimes gets missed in the context of this short story, which is what constitutes the authentic human being. And at the end, we'll get to why this weird little story matters, as well as why we should keep dreaming of Mars. Not in an Elon Musk kind of way, but in the open-hearted, strange, full of possibilities and joyful way that Philip K. Dick does. But first, what does it mean to want Mars? Because when I read this story, I keep coming back to that evocative first line. He awoke and wanted Mars. It's like that classic story in a sentence. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. Both of them contain whole narratives before the story even begins, and a dozen questions that are going to drive what happens next, before we even properly met our protagonist, Douglas Quayle. And that opening sentence also flags what is going to drive this whole narrative: desire. Now, if you've seen our video on Total Recall, you know I've spun out a whole philosophical discussion of how this film is about the postmodern condition, about everybody selling something with an ulterior motive, and how the key to that game is desire. That film spends a lot of time establishing who Douglas Quaid is, whereas here we've got a short story. Instead, we get some of Philip K. Dick's most effective, efficient storytelling techniques deployed. We have a man who wakes into a desire that he can't explain. And next we have that classic Philip K. Dick move of taking that cosmically grand idea and our own yearnings for Mars and dumping it right into a tiny apartment, a humdrum life, an unhappy wife who's heard the speech 1,000 times and just wants some coffee, for Christ's sakes. The collision is so surreal that it starts setting off those chains of ideas that Dick spoke about in his letter, and it starts us asking, what is this? The genius of this move is that I think that in most of Dick's writings, despite having lived in this strange world their entire lives, Dick's protagonists are always asking themselves exactly this same question. What is this? Because the next thing that we learn is that Quayle can't have it. He cannot visit Mars. His wife tells him as much, and he knows that it's impossible too. So we have the next key element of Dick's approach to science fiction, the new idea, and how the very action of the story spins out of that idea. Because the new idea here is, but what if it wasn't impossible? And what's interesting for me is the context in which Dick is writing too. Unhappy wives and the husbands who they disappoint, turning up so often in Dick's fiction. We've talked about Deckard's wife Iran in our Electric Sheep video, for instance. That it's kind of hard not to conclude that Dick is drawing from personal experience here, from the slow collapse of his second marriage at the time, and perhaps the dark thought that this is just how marriages go, for him at least. But there's also this context of sci-fi writing that he's writing in. In the letter, he sharply distinguishes himself from writing space adventures because he feels the stinging criticisms of seemingly more respectable authors like Doris Lessing. He names her, I'm not entirely sure why. So his characters, although we're not quite into a generation of hard sci-fi yet, can't just grab their hat and their ray gun and hop the next flight to Mars like they would in a space adventure. So what do we do when something is impossible? We fake it, which is where Recall Incorporated, the desire and the new idea come together. It's the grandest longing a person can have, blocked by the dullest obstacles there are. And Dick's solution is a stroke of genius, fake memories implanted, not as a horror story or as a mystery, but as the lower workings in the bowels of capitalism, just, kind of in space. As Jonathan Lethem points out in one of his prefaces and introductions to Dick's work, Dick's characters go on carrying briefcases and sending memos and sweating their alimony payments and dreaming of getting away from it all, even when they've already emigrated or moved or seen Mars or seen the future. They don't escape into the genre. They drag the office with them. It's that classic, wherever you go, there you are, coupled with the realization that one cannot escape the self. Dick's innovation is combining the cosmic with the shabbiness of the everyday, and it makes his sci-fi less ridiculous and somehow more human, no matter how unimaginable the valleys of Mars might be. And it also gives every other character in the story permission to write Quayle off as ridiculous, as an unimportant and tiny man that is to be moved wherever they want or however they want to get what they want or to get the job done. He's disposable or irrelevant. His wife dictates to him what's going to happen. Perhaps they'll have a holiday at the bottom of the sea. And McLean almost gets impatient when Quayle's not falling for the sale fast enough and handing over his cash. To solve a problem, they wipe his memory and slam him into a cab. And the UN police, when they get involved, they basically just want to close the file and off him right then and there. Quayle is a pain to be resolved, a little man. And again, not to draw too much from Dick's biography or to psychoanalyze the story too much, but it kind of seems like where Dick was in his life and his career at the time too. By the mid-60s, Dick was producing at a rate that's frankly alarming to look at, the novel after novel, on no money and a great deal of amphetamines, while the literary world treated science fiction as something a serious person should be embarrassed to do. He later described this stretch of his life in terms of a breakdown. He wrote, quote, "To select science fiction writing as a career was an act of self-destruction. In fact, most writers, let alone most other people, could not even conceive of someone considering it. In the 50s, Cleo and I lived on $90 a month when we could not even pay the fine on an overdue library book and when we were literally living on dog food. It's bleak, but it's where characters like Quayle and their dilemmas are coming from. And just like dreaming of Mars, Philip K. Dick could not help but continue writing in a genre that people looked down on. He himself was one of those tiny little men. At least he felt that way. And it's also why I find the timing of the Mariner 4 mission so romantic and curious. Surely it played a role in Dick writing this story about Mars. Surely catching a glimpse of this impossible place stoked his own hope that people might one day see it for themselves. It seems shocking, but it might just be possible. And I think that's what Dick is trying to do here too. Later in life, Dick tried to define science fiction, and he was firm in that it wasn't the future and it wasn't technology and it certainly wasn't space adventure that characterized it. What made something science fiction for him was the single new idea, what he called the conceptual dislocation. You take the world as it is, you change one thing, and you change it in a way that's coherent enough to follow and yet strange enough to break the reader up. He had a lovely phrase for the effect, the shock of disrecognition. You look at the world the story builds and you recognize it, but you fail to recognize it at the same time. So what's the new idea here? It isn't Mars. We've been writing about Mars for a century or more. It isn't implants or telepathy or secret agents. That's all kind of standard issue sci-fi pulp furniture, and Dick knew that as well. The dislocation is something much closer to home. It's a world where your private longing has become a product, where the thing you want most can be packaged, can be priced, and can be sold to you across a desk by a guy in a nice grey suit. Well, whatever colour suit it is here. And then when it turns out to be inconvenient, it can be reclassified and confiscated by the state. The new idea isn't the technology that fakes the memory. It's a society that's figured out how to do business with what's in the inside of your skull, even the parts you may not know about yet. And that's why Mariner 4, I think, sits so well at the front of all of this. Out there, in the same handful of years, the real Mars was getting smaller. It was turning from a screen for our dreams into a measured, photographed, slightly disappointing ball of rock. And in here, and on Dick's page, Mars was going the other way. The more impossible it becomes for Quayle to actually reach, the more enormous it gets inside of him. The planet shrinks and the desiring swells. And if you know your Philip K. Dick, that's the exact spot where the reality really starts to crack. So Quayle goes to buy his way to Mars, and what Recall sells him is one of the great sales pitches in science fiction. Because of course, Recall Incorporated is a business. Dick can imagine World War III, he can imagine nuclear devastation, he can imagine mutants and alien invaders, but not the end of capitalism. That, like the cockroaches, will be with us until the end of time. And Recall is a pretty shabby little business too. That's also classic Philip K. Dick. It's selling the most radical thing you can possibly imagine, reconfiguring your memories and what makes you distinctly you, your perspective, as a cheap holiday package. And I kind of love the way the small-time salesman McLean sells it to him too. It's philosophically shocking, and yet so Tom Waits stepped right up. He says, "Mr. Quayle," McLean said patiently, "as you explained in your letter to us, you have no chance, no possibility in the slightest of ever actually getting to Mars. You can't afford it. And what is much more important, you could never qualify as an undercover agent for Interplan or anybody else. This is the only way you can achieve your lifelong dream. Am I not correct, sir? You can't be this. You can't actually do this," he chuckled. "But you can have been and have done. We can see to that. And our fee is reasonable. No hidden charges." He smiled encouragingly. I mean, that's money in the bag for McLean, with a line as smooth and metaphysically devastating as, "You can't be this, do this, but you can have been and have done." He can't sell a future, but he can sell a past. And when I put it that way, sounds familiar, doesn't it? Sounds a bit political, doesn't it? Certain figures selling us in a golden age that can have been, even though we know, as Heraclitus did, that we can't river our way back to that ever again. But the have been and the have done are powerful enough to get the sale done anyway. And of course, Quayle buys, and that, as we all know, is when the trouble starts. Plus, in the story, the unsettling part is how reasonable it all sounds. We're told all the time now that experiences are worth more than possessions. Spend money on the trip, the concert, the once-in-a-lifetime thing, not on the stuff, which is fair enough. But once it's all over, what do we actually have? Half a memory, fading quickly? Or a few stories to tell over dinner that change in the telling, like a photocopy of a photocopy? A few photos that we'll file away and never look at again? So, why not just skip it all and settle for less and buy the only part that sticks, the half memory? It's a great pitch, and yet in classic Philip K. Dick style, it calls into the question the reasons why we would ever do anything. And I think we all know that deep down the sale here isn't the experience, but the self. McLean is selling Quayle a better version of himself, a better edition of the man, because he springs for the optional extras too, be a secret agent. And then the procedure fails and we get the trademark twist. He was actually all of the things he wanted all along. And now, after the botched procedure, he has to deal with the reality of that too, which doesn't quite match up with the dream. It comes with more armed cops and telepathic implants than he expected. I think what also makes this great reversal in the story so good is that, well, now he has the truth. But it doesn't make the world any clearer. It makes the world shakier, in fact. In an ordinary story, the truth arrives as a kind of proof, but here it just makes everything a whole lot less certain. And I like that even Dick's villains are shit kickers, too. They have to pull each other aside and discuss what the hell they do in the mission gone awry. They too have to answer to bosses and have to justify overtime. They and Quayle and us never quite get the full story as well. We just get bits of the truth erupting sideways through the cracks in a system or a process that's supposed to kind of keep it all held down. You can see why Hollywood loved this story, I think, and why I kept coming back to it, because there isn't the big reveal. There's just cracks and tension and falling in deeper, which is really how our forms of truth and realization arrive in the real world as well. Not one big parlor reveal, but an, oh shit, as another piece of the scenery comes unstuck. It has both huge dramatic potential and it feels true to life at the same time, which is quite an accomplishment when we're dealing with interplanetary conspiracies, assassinations, and a telepathic implant. But it keeps coming back to one of the two questions that haunt Dick's career, which is, what is reality? What is real? I think a lot of people gloss over Dick's life and struggles and think that this is like a natural response to heavy use of LSD or something, but it's not. Dick's drug use is well known, and for the bulk of his writing career, he didn't actually touch LSD or that kind of stuff. Instead, I think it has a far more proletarian origin. Dick's questioning of the real comes from being constantly on the bottom and seeing the thoughtless cynicism and manipulation at the top. Which leads us to another essential Philip K. Dick question. How much can they take away or erase before you stop being human? So there's the obvious philosophy we could do here, Locke and Hume and the rest of it. And we've done it elsewhere, but Dick is way ahead of us. He's read a lot of this. He's seriously digested it, and he's now doing something much stranger with it. The twist. The new idea, because the casual answer is that we are our memories, and if that's what constitutes who we are, then it must also be what makes us human, right? But Quayle's memories are gone, and at least in the story, he's still him. And they're not just gone, but they're kind of erupting and disappearing. They're unstable, and they come back and then go again. He admits to the voice in his head that they seem to be battling it out, and they're almost to oblivion. Then Dick drops in a line, not about the memories themselves, but about the absence and the longing to be whole that absence creates. He says they couldn't erase that, the story tells us. It's not a memory, but a desire. Now, the easy way to read this is as a clue. He wants Mars because, he really meant to Mars, right? The clerk says that he has a secret to pass. The desire, the fingerprint of it is still left. Mystery solved, roll the credits or end the story or whatever. But that makes the story much smaller than I think it is. The wanting isn't a piece of evidence pointing back at the buried fact. The wanting is the man. As we've talked about in other videos, we are the things that we desire and that we strive for. This is part of identity constitution. It makes the entire action of the story possible. And it nets Quayle a congratulations from the UN Secretary General at the end to boot. He is actually a hero because he desperately wants to be a hero. A person is also a pattern. It's a direction. We see that in our RoboCop video, for example, as I discussed, when the maybe Murphy, maybe RoboCop can't remember his family but feels the importance, the relationality of their absence. I think we also see it in real life too, with people we know. The musician who becomes a musician because they've always had that desire to be a musician. It's the self-fulfilling prophecy, the way, as Nietzsche puts it, that we become what we are. So Quayle has no idea why he wants Mars, and it becomes the most true thing about him. It's a little sad in a way, but it's also a little bit of a joke too. But ultimately, it is his. It's what makes him who he is. And Dick, he flips over the board on us one more time, that great punchline at the end, because when Interplan can't safely erase the dangerous memory, they go hunting for a harmless one to bury it under. The deepest, silliest wish fulfillment they can dredge up, something so childish that it couldn't possibly be a threat to anyone. And what they hit right at the bottom of him is this, that when Quayle was a boy, an alien expedition came scouting the Earth for an invasion, and they called it off. An alien invader spared the whole planet because a small, kind child was gentle to them when nothing made him be gentle, and they were so moved that they struck a bargain. Earth stays safe as long as Douglas Quayle is alive. It's ridiculous, of course. I'm pretty sure it's meant to be. It's the daydream of a lonely kid who needs to believe that he matters. And the one character in the story even remarks that he can't believe that their organisation employed somebody like this. But isn't it also so relatable? Isn't it also the most moving thing in the story? Isn't it yet another gentle, beautiful answer to Philip K. Dick's final obsessive question that we've been chasing the whole way through? The world was saved by human empathy, which, if you know Dick's work or Electric Sheep or Blade Runner, he thinks is the invisible line that runs through all thinking, his thinking, everybody's thinking about what it is that makes us human. Our ability, in the most ridiculous and extreme of circumstances, to embrace the plight of the other. Everyday slights, crushing realities and possibilities, swindles, cops, paperwork, paranoia are everywhere in Philip K. Dick's work. And they never win. The empathy always does. This beautiful little story, We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, is a cosmic microcosm of just that. just like those grainy little low-res photos of a Martian sunset that promise a whole world still to be discovered. It's a long way for such a small, funny story to travel, and it's why I think that no one can ever quite leave it alone. Which brings us finally to the movie, because Hollywood could not leave this story alone either, and you can see exactly why. The premise is almost unfairly good. A man buys the fake memory of a trip to Mars and finds out he may really have taken it. That's a thriller, that's a mystery, and it's a philosophy seminar in one pitch that you can make right across the lunch table in 8 seconds flat. The rights got bought in the 70s, and then the thing sat in development for the better part of 2 decades. It drifted from studio to studio and director to director, while the script went through something like 40 drafts, and the writers still couldn't find a third act for the thing. The most telling chapter of all that belongs to David Cronenberg, who was attached to direct this film for about a year, and he wrote a dozen drafts of his own. He was chasing the version you'd really want from Cronenberg that was strange, inwardly focused, faithful to the metaphysical unease in Dick's original. And here's how it ended in his own words. He handed the final draft to the producer, Ron Shusett, and said, "Here, I think I've got it. This is it." And Shusett read it and said, "You know what you've done? You've done the Philip K. Dick version." Cronenberg said, "Well, isn't that what we were supposed to be doing?" And Shusett said, "No, we wanted the Raiders of the Lost Ark Go to Mars version." It's a joke almost as great as the one at the end of the story, because it feels like it belongs in a Philip K. Dick story. Because the hero, in this case Cronenberg, is searching for the new idea that wakes you up, just like Philip K. Dick would have, and the way he told us to as well. And all this time, what Hollywood wants is the old idea, the one that will put us to sleep. It took Paul Verhoeven and a big action star to finally sneak this story past the Hollywood studios and producers. Total Recall is a great film, and you should check out our video on it, but it is something else. It's a big, dumb, fun something else, like a lot of Verhoeven's films that had to pretend to be something else in order to pass through. But let's finish where Dick finishes, which is back with the wanting. Out there in 1965, Mariner gave us the real Mars, and the real Mars turned out to be smaller than we might have hoped, with craters, silence, with grainy photos and data. And on the page in those same years, Dick did the opposite. He took Mars and he pushed it inward until it was the size of a man's entire unlived life. For Quayle, it was never really a planet. It was the name for the part of him that wouldn't fit. Too big for the apartment and the job and the unhappy marriage and the salary, and finally too big even for the people who tried to take it out of his skull. Most of us, I think, know that feeling, even if our Mars probably goes by another name. Probably not Mars, though if it is Mars, I respect the ambition, and I'd only suggest maybe checking the cancellation policy on that trip. But there's usually some version of it that we hold on to. Another place, another life, some self we suspect that we can finally become if only we could just get there. The easy move is to call those longings escapism, and sometimes, sure, that is what they are. But Dick's stranger comfort is that they aren't always that either. Sometimes the thing you can't stop wanting isn't a way out of your life. Sometimes it's the truest part of you, and it's the wanting finding its way back to the surface. Sometimes the wanting is where the real and the human has been buried all along. He once said that choosing to write science fiction, as I quoted, was an act of self-destruction. That's how little it paid and how badly it was regarded in his lifetime. So it's no accident that his little men keep getting stripped down to nothing, erased and rewritten and filed away as somebody else's problem. He knew the feeling inside out. But the answer that runs through all of his work is that the only way is through, that on the far side of that breakdown, there's something new, and that the new is worth the cost of getting there. For a man who lived to feel what he called the joy of the discovery of newness, I think that was enough to carry him and us and maybe everyone through. But that's it for this episode of Philosophical Book Club. So until next time, be wise and be kind, and don't stop wanting that different sunrise.